Right now, there is a dead bomb sitting smack dab in the center of the American economy. Because you see, commercial real estate in this country is in a state of total freefall. Visit any mainstream commercial building here in New York. On the ground floor, everything looks great. You have restaurants, Starbucks, artisanal bakeries, and so on. It looks great. But you go up the elevator, and you'll find that floor after floor after floor after floor is nothing but absolutely emptied out office space. No companies, no employees, no workers, no nothing. Just a giant loan from the bank that no longer has any rent to support it. That's exactly what I'm talking about. It's fair to say that we are living in a new Gilded Age. The 1920s was, of course, a Gilded Age, and the 2020s appear to also be a Gilded Age. On the surface, everything looks fine. It's New York City, it's the commerce capital of America, you have skyscrapers packed one next to each other, people walking around. I mean, again, on the surface, everything looks bustling. But on the inside, you have emptied out buildings one after the other with floor after floor being totally vacant. In fact, let's move this episode somewhere a bit more apt. But of course, it's not only New York. The same is true in many other large cities as well. Chicago, Dallas, Houston, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, Denver, Seattle, San Jose, Portland, Atlanta, and so on. In fact, right now, the U.S. has roughly 1 billion square feet of office space sitting empty just like this. Just for a visual, if you stacked all these empty floors one on top of another, it would make a building that's 48,000 stories tall enough to reach the International Space Station. And with many of the loans on these properties set to mature within the next 2 years, well, this is a ticking time bomb for the economy as a whole. Because the problem with the scale, it's not going to only hurt the rich investors who happen to own these buildings. Instead, just like with the financial crash of 2008, it might ultimately be you and I, the average American taxpayer, who's going to be footing the bill. In fact, there's an old saying that captures this moment perfectly. If you owe the bank $1 million, the bank owns you. If you owe the bank $100 million, you own the bank. And that's a pretty apt metaphor for what's happening at this very moment. Because at the same time that office space is looking like this across the whole country, you have a whopping $1.2 trillion worth of debt that's about to mature in the next 2 years. And what a lot of banks across the country are about to find out is that that $1.2 trillion just ain't there no more. However, before we get into which banks are going to be most affected, and it's probably not the ones you think, let me back up for a quick moment and explain how we got here. Like many structural problems, the cracks began to really show in the year 2020. You see, even before the pandemic, you had many analysts already sounding the alarm, saying that the commercial real estate market was in bubble territory, and that any serious disruptions might burst that bubble. And that appears to be exactly what happened. 3 factors led to the implosion of commercial real estate. The first problem came in the form of lockdowns, when 2 weeks to flatten the curve extended into months and then subsequently years. The need for renting office space dropped off a cliff. But then, even after the lockdowns ended, many companies chose to downsize their office footprints by implementing a hybrid work model. You work from home a few days, and then you come into the office for a few days. Some companies, though, went even further. For instance, Yelp, which at the time had about 4,400 employees, they closed almost all of their offices nationwide, and they went completely remote. In so doing, the CEO of Yelp, he released this statement right here, saying that the future of work is remote, and that since only about 1% of their workforce was choosing to come into the office every day, they decided to just close almost all their offices. Now, of course, not all companies took this approach. Many companies did wind up returning to the office. However, the reality is that even now, which is 4 years after the pandemic, many people are still working from home. In fact, there was a recent report that was published by Castle Systems. It's a large security firm, and the report was looking at corporate foot traffic across 10 different cities. Now, Castle, they run many of the security checkpoints that are used in these large corporate buildings, and so they were able to track the number of security card swipes in 2,000 different locations. And they found that even though office occupancy is at its highest level since the pandemic, it's still only 50% of the pre-COVID levels, meaning that it's the best that it's been in the past 4 years, but that it's still only half of what it used to be. And so for commercial real estate, these were the first 2 nails in the coffin. You had the lockdowns, followed by the work from home phenomena. But here's where it got substantially worse. Because at the very same time that these rents were drying up, the Fed dramatically increased their interest rates.
Tonight, for the first time in 3 years, interest rates rising, meaning what you pay to borrow money, everything from a new mortgage to a car loan to your credit cards, is going up.
The cost of borrowing money went from something like 3% in the year 2020 to about 6 or 7% today. And this really matters for commercial real estate because the loans on commercial properties are a bit different than the type of loan that you or I would get for a house. Here's a simple comparison. Let's say you bought a single-family house in the year 2019. The home was $200,000, you put 20% down, and for the rest, you get a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. You got lucky, it was 3%, and so for the next 30 years, you just pay $1,000 a month, which pays off the principal as well as the interest. I think most people are familiar with this standard type of a mortgage. However, here's how the loans for commercial real estate work. If you were going to buy a $200 million building, you would take out a loan from a bank. But this loan is a bit different. The payment schedule is structured as if the loan was for 30 years. But actually, this loan is only for 5 years. And so, for those 5 years, you would just pay a normal mortgage payment, just like you would on a house. But at the end of those 5 years, you have two options. You can either make a balloon payment and pay off the remaining 25 years in one lump sum, or you can refinance the debt at whatever the current market rate happens to be. And then the cycle just repeats itself for another 5 years. That's a very simplified explanation. There's a lot of nuance to these loans, but that's generally how it works. And so the problem here is pretty obvious. If you bought an office building in the year 2019 with a 3% loan, well, by 2024, that office building is no longer generating any profit in terms of rents. And if you could actually convince a lender to refinance the debt, your interest rate would now be double, 6 or 7%. And if you do the math, that small change in rate would increase the amount that you owe in that building by about $128 million. And so this reality is leaving the owners of a lot of these buildings completely underwater. You have no rental income, you have sky-high refinancing rates, and so many are choosing to just walk away, leaving the banks with the properties that they can then foreclose on. And as such, the value of these buildings have just nosedived. Here's just a few recent examples. In San Francisco, there was a 22-story building at 350 California Street. Back in 2019, this building sold for $300 million. But given the fact that it's now mostly empty, it sold last year for just $61 million, which is a cool 80% drop in value. Likewise, here in Manhattan, there's a huge office building located at 135 West 50th Street. It takes up about half a block, and it's 23 stories tall. Back in 2006, this building was worth $332 million. But just earlier this month, in August, that same building sold for just $8.5 million, which is a cool 97% haircut. Over in LA, you have a skyscraper called the Gas Company Tower, which had a value of about $632 million back in the year 2020, but just earlier this month, in a foreclosure sale, it went for $215 million, which is a 65% discount. And the list just goes on and on. Over in Baltimore, you have the White Marsh Mall, one of the largest malls in the city, and it recently appraised for just $80 million, down from $300 million just 10 years ago. Over in LA, you had a Chinese mystery investor buy a huge skyscraper for $170 million less than what was owed on it. In New York, you had Blackstone just file a foreclosure on a massive 33-story building over in Hell's Kitchen. The Townsend building over in San Francisco, it just sold for a 50% discount. 1750 H Street over in Washington, D.C. just sold for a 72% discount. The AON Center in downtown LA just sold for a 45% discount. Union Bank Plaza, which is a 40-story building over in LA, it just sold for a 47% discount. And so on and so on. There are hundreds of these commercial foreclosures every single month. Also, just as an aside, if you want to see the current state of these foreclosures moving forward, just head on over to the 10-X website. It has a rolling list of commercial real estate properties that are set to go up for a 2-day auction. And I mean, just look at those prices. The starting bids are well below what you would likely consider reasonable for these types of properties. You have huge office buildings going for just $1 or $2 million. Now, obviously, these are great deals. If you are looking for an office building right now, it's probably a great time to buy it. And so the winners of this whole situation are people who have cash and they're looking for commercial real estate. However, the losers are ultimately the banks. They loaned out trillions of dollars looking for good returns, but are now just left with a bunch of buildings that they can sell for pennies on the dollar. And this is where you get to the debt bubble. As you can see, delinquency in paying back these loans, it went from 3% in the first quarter of 2022 to a whopping 17%, a five-fold increase. Furthermore, as we mentioned at the top of the episode, $1.2 trillion worth of real estate debt is set to mature over the next 2 years, meaning that about $1.2 trillion worth of this debt will have to be either paid off in balloon payments or refinanced. But because many of these investors are underwater, a lot of them will probably just default. Now, of course, not everyone is going to default on their loans, but based on these numbers, based on the vacancy rates, the delinquency rates, and the fire sales happening across the country, well, there's a good chance that a huge percentage of this $1.2 trillion will just get wiped out. And when it does, the banks that are too heavily weighted towards real estate might be in serious trouble. I mean, you probably remember what happened just earlier this year to New York Community Bank.
New York Community Bank Corp., the parent company of Flagstar Bank, which has been on precarious footing due to mounting real estate losses, found itself in an even more unenviable position after Thursday night. That's when the company reported its fourth quarter losses were $2.4 billion worse than it had earlier stated.
A big chunk of their business was commercial and industrial real estate in Manhattan. Their losses became staggering, about 10 times what they were expected to be. They had to cut their dividend payments. That led to their stock price falling to the floor, and ultimately, their credit rating was changed to junk status. In fact, New York Community Bank, they survived barely by the skin of their teeth. It was only because investors who were worried about a broader market crash, they lent them $1 billion in order to stabilize the bank. That's how volatile this can all be. Within a matter of a few days, a seemingly strong bank can be on the verge of collapse. And moving forward, with this $1.2 trillion worth of real estate debt about to mature, it's the smaller regional banks that are in most danger. That's because about 56% of all outstanding commercial real estate loans are held by smaller banks. Up on your screen right now is a list of some of the smaller banks that are most exposed to commercial real estate loans. The number that you see next to each bank is the percentage that commercial real estate makes up of their total loan amount. And so at the top, you have Bank OZK, based out of Arkansas, with 68%. Then you have Home Bank Shares and Pacific Premier at 63, IBC at 59, the parent company of our old friend New York Community Bank at 57, and so on and so forth. And you can just imagine what might happen to a bank that has to foreclose on a huge part of 60% of their outstanding loans. However, it's also worth mentioning that it's not only the small banks. The major US banks also have huge exposure to commercial real estate. Take a look. JP Morgan, 12.6% of the loans are commercial real estate. For Bank of America, it's about 7%. First Citizens Bank is 15, Wells Fargo is 21, Citizens Bank is 23, Key Bank is 16, US Bank is 15, PNC is also 15, Capital One is 15, and so on and so forth. Now, as you can see, these larger banks are better diversified, but they're still at risk of having billions of dollars worth of defaults over the next several years. And of course, while we can never be certain of what might happen in the future, if the past is any indication, what might very likely happen is that you'll have smaller banks get wiped out, the larger banks will come in and buy up their assets for pennies on the dollar, there will be massive consolidation in the banking industry as a whole, and if there are any major losses, well, the American federal government will come in and backstop the whole thing in order to maintain stability. But of course, the federal government doesn't have any of its own money. It's ultimately you and I, the American taxpayers, that'll be footing the bill. That's the beauty of modern capitalism. If you'd like to go deeper into the problems that's facing commercial real estate, I'll throw all the links to my research notes. You'll be able to find them down in the description box below this video. That's, by the way, I should mention that same description box right below those like and subscribe buttons, both of which I hope you take a quick moment to smash so that this information can reach ever more people. If you want to check out Epic TV, I'll throw the link. It'll be right there at the top of the description box below. And then, until next time, I'm your host, Roman from the Epic Times. Stay informed, and most importantly, stay free.